Hey friends, welcome to the Church Planting Podcast. I'm Greg Nettle and I serve as president of Stadia Church Planting, where our vision is for every child on the planet to have a church, the hope of Jesus. We do that by helping you start thriving, growing, multiplying churches for the next generation. On this episode of the Church Planting Podcast, we're going to be talking about faith and foolishness when it comes to finances. And very appropriately, we have my friend and co-worker, Matt Murphy, with us as our guest. Matt serves as the COO of Stadia, overseeing our finances, IT, human resources. He helps sets the strategic direction of Stadia. And Matt is smart, finishing up his doctorate in business management. And I am thrilled to have Matt Murphy on the Church Planting Podcast. Well, I'm absolutely delighted to have this episode of the Church Planting Podcast. On this, we have Matt Murphy, who's just a really dear friend to me, but also my kind of right-hand person in Stadia world, my colleague in ministry. Matt, welcome to the Church Planting Podcast.
It's awesome to be on the podcast, Greg. I remember doing a little bit of the editing for your very first episode, so it's fun to be here at this point.
Yeah, we're approaching 100 episodes, and you've been with us the whole journey, which is very cool. And Matt, you've been the CFO of Stadia now for quite a while, but you recently moved into more of a chief operating officer, executive director type role, but still overseeing all of Stadia's finances, which is both a joy and a challenge. Anybody working in finances. And on this episode, we're going to talk about kind of faith and foolishness in finances, which I think is a great topic for all of our church planters that are out there, all of our church leaders that are multiplying, and business people that are listening and joining us as well. So let's just kind of define it. When it comes to faith in finances, Matt, how would you delineate that, faith in finances?
Yeah, I think when you think about the finances of an organization and the faith that you have around the finances of the organization, faith comes into play of understanding that if God has provided you with a vision for something, then he's going to provide you with the resources in order to accomplish that thing. So having this attitude that God will provide, or having not even just attitude, but having the faith and the hope that God will provide for the vision that he's given you, that's where I think faith really plays into.
And God develops our faith through finances as well, right? I remember back when River Tree, where I was senior pastor for years and years, I remember sitting in my office praying for enough money to pay the first, the electric bill when we were just a very small startup, right? And it would seem miraculously that money would come in, and then the organization grows much larger. And now you're sitting there going, oh man, how's God going to provide for this? And he so often does, but there are times when he doesn't, or doesn't seem to. And so let's move to that. Let's delineate what's foolishness when it comes to finances.
Yeah. So, in a previous job, I went through a layoff and watched that organization go through some struggles on their financial end. And one of the things that was foolish in some of the ways that was handled was just not having a plan. So the organization just didn't have a plan. They weren't thinking about the ground that they were standing on. They weren't doing the work to actually make change. So they were just watching their finances fall without doing anything to shift that, or to analyze why that might be happening. We say a lot, hope's not a strategy. So I think that's really, really essential to have. Like if you don't have hope in your work, like your work's going to be really burdensome. But hope isn't a strategy. It's a tool.
Yeah. Okay. So Matt, when we talk about faith and foolishness, there's really pitfalls on both sides.
Totally.
Can you talk about that? What are some of the pitfalls, maybe that we've experienced at Stadia or that you've watched in other organizations?
Yeah, totally. I think on the faith side, one of the things that happens that's problematic is poor stewardship. So this idea that we're going to hold on to money or war chest funds to save up for a rainy day. The problem is in your organization, and it's churches especially, I think, because there's a mandate for us to be out there making disciples. But I think this is true of any organization. it's hard to move forward if you're war chesting because you're holding on to that money, and money in your bank account is not advancing the mission of your organization. Now, I'm not saying that you shouldn't have reserves, and that's kind of on the foolish side. The foolish side of it would be like saying, all right, we have $10 to spend, and then spending all $10 on your mission with no plan to have the $10 the next day to do the same thing again. So it's the overspending. And I would say, every organization I've been a part of has had a push pull between those two tensions, including state.
Well, and Matt, even on the faith side, when you talk about war chesting, it's not just churches and not-for-profit organizations. It's certainly all of us as individuals. We know for a fact that sitting in donor-advised funds right now, and I'm not anti-donor advised funds. I think they're brilliant, a way to tax shelter and do some wonderful things. But, there are billions and billions of dollars sitting in donor-advised funds right now that could be used for advancement of the kingdom. And so that's a challenge. How much do you keep in those funds? How much do you advance the kingdom right now? And, obviously we want to have a biblical perspective on this. And the Bible obviously talks about finances a ton. Where do you see faith being played out? Biblical example of faith in the Bible.
Yeah, I was thinking about that as I was preparing to meet with you today, and two areas that pulled out from the Bible that speak into this, and they're both from the book of Matthew, which goes with my name, so I tend to be in that space a lot. Uh, on the faith side, I think about the parable of the talents. So Matthew 25, this idea that there's a wise investor who takes these talents that he has and invests them in order to create something that's even larger and have a larger impact down the line. There's a faith that if I invest this or if I spend this or use it, then it's going to create some larger impact in the future. And I think that that's an essential way to function. This idea that our investments, our wise investments, will yield larger results in the future. I think that that's one area. On the foolish side, also from Matthew 7, you think about building on the sand rather than on bedrock. And, that's just silly. Like, I live less than a mile from a beach, and we have to build our houses in very particular ways because the ground is literally not stable. If I just tried to build a house on a slab where I live, the next heavy rain, my house would literally fall over. So thinking about that with your finances is really essential as well. Do you have a plan in place or the appropriate base to be stable in your organization?
Well, and biblically, what person would go out and build a tower or build a new building and not count the cost in advance to make
Yeah.
sure that we can pay for it and then maintain it and so
So,
forth. So there is this balance, and we've had an amazing board chairman for the last 7 years, just stepped down because his term ended. Steve Porter, who's a businessman. And I love having him on the board. Have loved that because he's challenged both you and I to keep that balance between faith, but also to present a balanced budget, right? And to take care of that. Now, Matt, you and I, we've worked together for years now, and side by side, and so forth. And so I'm the senior leader. One of my primary jobs is to cast vision, keep making sure we're moving forward. From your seat, what do you need from a senior leader? What do you need from me? What's one of the things I bring to the table in the financial arena?
I mean, vision is huge. You mentioned that you bring vision. I think that is an essential thing that the senior leader of an organization brings because it allows for the people who are like me to know where we're going in order to like help create the plan for getting to that place. The other thing I think that's really important and is true for you, absolutely true for you, and true for church leaders that I've worked with in the past, and frankly true for the key leaders of for-profit organizations I've worked for in the past as well. You're the person that has the most relationships with the people who have the most capacity. Um, I know that that might not necessarily be true in every organization, but it's been true in every organization that I've worked in. So there is that aspect of the people who are your largest investors, whether they're individual people or in the case of Stadia, we have individuals and church leaders. Those people, they make their decisions based on vision of where they want their money to be the parable of the talents. They want to invest in a way where their return on investment, even if it's not dollars, kingdom return on investment is significantly larger than the input that they put into it. So you have those relationships coupled with the ability to cast that vision of where we are going as an organization to help shore up and secure the finances of the organization. I think that it's a role that we don't talk about enough in the church, that the leader should be, also kind of one of your chief development officers for raising funds for the organization. We don't like to talk about that sometimes, but I think that that's a role that I've watched you embrace and appreciate. And I think I've seen in other churches where the leader has not embraced that and they struggle to retain those key investors that really fuel the finances of the organization.
Okay, so we haven't talked about this, Matt, but so what's the worst thing I can do to make your job hard?
Oh man, that's a great question. I think I think it's back to that vision. Like if the vision is not clear or if it's shifting all the time, that makes creating a budget or creating a plan impossible. Like if I know I'm headed towards Baltimore tomorrow, and then you call me and say, no, we're going to DC, which from my house is the opposite direction. Now all my plans messed up, and that has a cascading effect throughout the organization. So it's
Yeah,
not
that's
just one
good.
like that.
And Matt, we look at in Stadia world. How far out are we looking at projections and looking at finances and budgets?
At a minimum in the Stadia space, we are looking 24 months out, but in general, we have a fairly good idea of what we look like 36 months into the future. But we look 24 months on a rolling basis. So every month we like very meticulously move a budget forward. Now we do create a new budget every year. So we are making adjustments constantly. We live in an agile time where things change all the time. So we're always changing it. We try to have a pretty good solid picture of what we expect to do over the next 24 months and a rough idea of what we're going to do over the next 36.
And I that's been really helpful because coming out of leading River Tree, we were really only looking at the current budget year. And that's good. And if you're doing that out there, I applaud everyone doing that. But if you
Yeah.
can get to the point where you're looking at a rolling 24 months, that is really, it's like having an extra sermon that you're preaching in the bank that's ready to go. And it's really helpful, especially if you're, adding new staff or thinking about buildings and expanding to new countries and things like that. Matt, now I'm going to answer this question after you do, but in your role, what do you think is the most important thing you bring to the organization from a financial role?
I thought about three things in this. I think kind of stewardship in general, like being able to see the money that's coming in and knowing what we want to spend and making sure that we do that in the most effective and appropriate way. But the way I do that is I feel like I have a pretty good knack for data and analytics. I can look at the numbers and see trends, identify trends, which help us identify if there's an area that needs to be invested in more from energy, like to raise funds in a particular area or to, identify potential new product lines or new sources of income for the organization. But being able to see those trend lines where, we were headed here and now we're headed here, or we were headed down and all of a sudden we're headed up, and being able to figure out why or what happened to do that.
Yeah, so I agree with that's a huge benefit to our organization. For me personally, as the senior leader, I love that you have your finger on the pulse of our finances. And as you know, the board required that I go get a financial certificate in corporate financing several years ago, which so that helps me understand the financial world certainly better and be able to read spreadsheets and
Sure.
P&Ls and different things. Um, but knowing and being able to trust you and that you are, finishing up your doctorate in business management and strategic planning and all those wonderful things that you're doing.
Yeah.
I mean, I love that you're continuing and growing in your leadership. The other thing I know is that I can trust you about projections. And what I mean by that is you're not presenting something saying, well, yeah, we're going to go with this real optimistic outlook that, and sometimes that can become pie in the sky.
Totally.
And I've been, in organizations where that has happened and then it doesn't happen. And now we're stuck. So I just love all that you bring to Stadia World. And I think there has to be that really good strategic melding, if you will, of the senior leader and the person who is overseeing all the operations and the finances,
Totally.
especially. So Matt, let's get real pragmatic with, the next few minutes of what we're
Sure.
talking about here. So how much money, faith and foolishness, how much money should we keep in reserves? I mean, we're an organization out there, you're a church. What's the goal that and not that everybody's going to attain. We aren't where we'd like to be yet in Stadia World, but
Yeah.
what's the goal of having how much in reserves?
Yeah. I think that's a dynamic number. So, I'll answer for Stadia first, and then I can kind of tell you a little bit more, but for Stadia, we're trying to hold 3 to 6 months of reserves, try more on the 6 month side of reserves at any given time. And reserves is an interesting thing because we're always bringing in dollars. Like we've never had a 0 month, and this is true for church. It's true for any business. Like we're pretty much never have a 0 month. So it's a matter of the predictability of your revenue. I think is a portion of how you determine how much reserves you have. So if you have super predictable revenue and there's no anticipated flaws and like pitfalls in the future, you know, global pandemic notwithstanding, um, we, you kind of know what things are going to be. So you might not need as huge a reserve because you're pretty steady in your revenue. Right. But just like your home income, I know what my income is going to be every month, but I still have an emergency. Um, but my emergency fund or the reserves for an organization, I think can be dynamic based on how consistent your revenue comes. So like if you're a brand new church plant and your revenue is based on the people who are coming in the door, who you don't know yet, you probably need a whole lot of reserves. Like you might want a year of reserves. And because a year of reserves is going to last more than a year, because again, you're never going to have a 0 month, but it allows you to draw down on it a long time. You just use the year as a reference point for how much you have. So with Stadia, if we're at 6 months, a 6 month reserve probably would actually take us a few years to
Yeah.
um, but you have to base that dynamically on what your predictability of your revenue is.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think the general rule of thumb that we'd encourage our church planners and church leaders is, man, you've got to get to a minimum of 3 months in reserve,
Absolutely.
ideally get to at least 6 months.
Okay.
And then depending on how volatile, whatever it is you're leading, it needs to go up from there. But in general, a 6 month reserve is a really healthy place. And when you get beyond that, now you got to look at, am I into one of the pitfalls and not, trusting God's faithfulness quite as much. Let's talk about budgeting from a pragmatic. We have an
Sure.
annual budget. Now, I remember at River Tree, we went through a 10-year run at River Tree where we were growing by 7 to 15%
Sure.
every single year. It was just crazy. And we were budgeting for that growth. Now, what hurt was the year when we didn't,
Right.
so talk about budgeting for leaders. How much do you bet with the faith side and how much do you bet with kind of more the flat? Yeah, just speak to that.
Yeah, I think we try to look at what God has done, and what God has done is a somewhat indicator of what God might do. So if you're having year over year increases of 5%, year after year after year after year, you might be able to predict that it's going to be in that same range. If you do the same activities, you might think it will be in the same range in that next year. So I think first thing is you look at history. Second thing, you look at new opportunities. So for example, with Stadia, we do special fundraising events. Like you're doing a trek in South America to Machu Picchu, and we're raising money alongside of that trek. Okay. So then now we add in extra things we know on top of that anticipated growth. And then I do think that there's a prayer factor in that. Like, what do we see as the trends in the environment around us? Like, are people investing more into missions or nonprofits, if you're a nonprofit leader or churches, are they investing less? There's all that data is available to you. Barna, Pew, tons of research firms are regularly researching giving trends in towards nonprofits, churches, and faith-based parachurch organizations. So the data is available. You make that data informed decision, spend some time in prayer, and then you make the decision. And so if you add a percent, that's, if you've been doing 5% per year and you add another percent based on your prayer and the data that you're reading, I think that's okay. So long as you're monitoring your um, budget in a really real time way. Like we have conversations every other week about the trends in Stadia. And I look at the forecast every single day to make sure that we are actually accomplishing the things that we set out to accomplish. And Stadia remains incredibly willing to adjust. If God sends a windfall of funds, then we will change it that way. If we're not hitting what we expected to hit, we'll change it the other direction. But that agility, uh, you know, I think budgets are awesome, but a year-long budget in today's world is an enormously long amount of
It's
time.
actually a guideline, right?
Yeah. So yeah, it's a guideline. Exactly. We get it approved by the board and we strive to hit that. And generally we're in the neighborhood. Um, but I mean, we have to remain willing to change minute to minute.
Yeah, that's good. Okay, Matt, so many new churches, they're putting their management team together, their board together, their elders, whatever their governing body is. How important is it on the board? So Matt comes to all the Stadia board meetings with me. And I love that because he's able to give clear and accurate pictures of so much of the operations of Stadia. And how important is it to have some business people that understand that? But you also need that faith side. Talk about the makeup of a board or management team.
Totally. I think the business side is great. Like you said, Steve Porter, who was the uh, board chair for us, has a huge business acumen. Our current board chair, Courtney Wright, comes from a financial business background prior to being in ministry, where she is now in Atlanta. That acumen for numbers and for understanding P&Ls, profit and loss, and budget versus actuals reports, I think is essential because that creates the accountability. The reason we have a board is in part to create accountability for us. So I think having that business minded piece is essential. However, I think the faith is really critical too, because we don't sell widgets. Like, we are in the business of seeing people come to know Jesus. And in Stadia in particular, we're doing that somewhat indirectly because we're helping new churches start that are then the people who are actually engaging people that are far from God. So there's a faith element of being able to see that, hey, we can't say we're going to have, we're going to sell 10 tractor trailers worth of material and it's going to result in X number of dollars. Ours is much more, I don't know, it's not squishy, but it's not as tangible. So having that faith element, I think, is really essential because that helps us understand the way that God is moving through the organization.
And so you want that balance. So you need both on your board.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And one can't dominate the other. There really does have to be that faith and reality and all of that going on.
I think you do, Greg. I think you do a really good job of cultivating both of those in everyone. And we definitely have people that leaned harder one way or the other. But I think part of the job of the leader is to pastor, so to speak, the board into understanding the tension between us.
Well, and I would say the other thing, Matt, that's God's done in me over the years is giving me and helping me grow in my deep appreciation for both sides.
Really.
Going, man, I am so thankful for this business person that often has to hold my feet to the fire. And I'm so thankful for this other person who is also calling me to come out and lead well towards the vision, right?
Totally.
You've got to have a deep appreciation for both. Matt, talk about a little bit about the thanking side of people in the finance realm.
Yeah, that's a great Stadia strives to be the most grateful organization on the planet. And Greg and I both have been in rooms recently with different people where they're like, man, I can't believe how grateful Stadia is. we do that in a lot of ways. We have a lot of care plans that we put in place for people who are helping to fund our mission. Uh, we send a lot of letters. I personally make it my goal to send 5 to 10 handwritten letters every week to donors and people who are engaged in the mission in one way or another. I think that's essential. If you're not doing that, then people are going to create their own narratives in their head. And if you're not being grateful and telling them what their money is doing, they're going to start to create their own narrative in their head. And then you're back to using hope as a strategy, that you hope that the narrative that they create is one that's positive, that their money is actually creating a kingdom return on investment.
Yeah, and I mean, Matt, if I'm walking through the halls of my local church and I see a worker in the children's area, I mean, I am always going to go, man, I am so thankful. I'm going to put my arm around them. Thankful that you're loving on our kids here and teaching them about Jesus. If somebody's up singing on the platform, I'm going to go, man, you just crushed it today and led me into the presence of God. And I think we have to have that same attitude towards those who are resourcing the kingdom
100%.
and say, hey, I just want you to know that, last year there were 150 new church plants that happened. And as a result of that, on Easter this year, I think it was, 500,000 people celebrated in Stadia churches somewhere in the world. And I want to thank you for making that possible on behalf of all of those people. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Okay, Matt, we need to wrap up now. I need to know though, what music are you listening to right now?
Oh man, that's I've been doing this thing called the 1001 album generator. It gives me a new album to listen to every day. So today's was Graceland from Paul Simon, which is
Love that album. Okay. And what book are you reading right now?
Right now I am reading a book called Rebel Girl. It's about a punk rock singer named Kathleen Hanna, who kind of spearheaded the riot girl feminist punk rock movement in the 90s.
Okay. And one more, what are you watching right now?
Ooh, that's a good one. I am watching Blown Away on Netflix, which is the glass blowing competition. And
I love that show.
I want to learn how to blow glass so badly now.
Matt Murphy, thank you for being on the Church Planting Podcast.
Thank you for having me, Greg.
Thanks for listening to the Church Planting Podcast, part of the Stadia Podcast Network. To find more great episodes and to see how Stadia can help you start thriving, growing, multiplying churches for the next generation, be sure to check out stadia.org/podcasts.